Someone sat across from you at some point, maybe at a dinner table, maybe in a car, or on the other end of a phone call. They said something or did something that you have not been able to put down since. You remember the moment, the exact words. Maybe you remember the look on their face, the one that told you they already knew what they were doing. And not long after, someone you trusted told you the right thing was to forgive them. Let go. Carrying resentment only poisons you. The healthy path is release. So you told yourself you had. You moved through the motions. You watched the person who hurt you continue through their life without any particular weight, while you managed the wreckage on your own. The forgiveness did not heal anything. It moved the furniture around in a burning room. Nietzsche had a name for this dynamic. He just was not kind enough to call it a virtue. If this is already landing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Friedrich Nietzsche spent a significant portion of his intellectual life doing something that made his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. He refused to treat forgiveness as automatically noble. In On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, he traced the roots of modern moral pressure back to what he identified as the psychology of the powerless. His argument was not that forgiveness is always wrong. It was something more unsettling than that. He argued that the cultural insistence on forgiveness, the social pressure that says a good person must absolve everything, is itself a mechanism of control. It serves the person who committed the act far more than it serves you. Nietzsche named this broader pattern raisonnement. He borrowed the French word deliberately because he believed the thing he was describing had no clean English equivalent. Raisonnement is what happens when people who cannot respond to an injury directly begin converting their inability to act into a moral framework. They cannot move. So instead, they redefine not moving as the superior choice. Forgiveness, in this analysis, is sometimes not strength. It is sometimes the story people tell themselves to make passivity feel sacred. He was precise about this distinction. He separated genuine transcendence from performed virtue. The question his philosophy forces you to ask is not whether you should forgive. It is whether the forgiveness is real or whether it is the response you have been conditioned to perform because refusing makes you look like the problem. That distinction matters more than most people are willing to examine, and it matters most in specific situations. There are 7 acts of disrespect that Nietzsche's philosophy, read honestly, does not ask you to forgive. The first is when someone betrayed your confidence. Not a slip, not carelessness in the heat of an argument. A deliberate act of taking what you trusted them with and converting it into something that served them. They heard something private, something you told them because you believed they were safe, and then they used it. In a conversation, in a room, with someone who had no right to know. Nietzsche wrote in Human, All Too Human, that the person who discloses another's secrets is not losing control of their tongue. They are wielding it. The disclosure is the weapon. The trust was simply the means of access. What separates this act from ordinary conflict is its architecture. To betray a confidence, you must first remember that you hold one. You must identify the moment, the audience, and the effect. That is not impulsiveness. That is premeditation. The person looked at what you gave them freely and chose to convert it into a tool. Forgiving this act does not restore the trust. It cannot. What it does is remove the one consequence the act was ever going to face. The person who betrayed your confidence does not get smaller when you forgive them. You do. The second act is public humiliation. There's a quality to this one that distinguishes it from every other form of cruelty. It requires an audience. Private cruelty is about damage. Public humiliation is about installation. The person is not simply trying to hurt you in the moment. They're trying to establish, in front of witnesses, a version of you that can be reduced. Nietzsche's distinction between master and slave morality is useful here, not as a moral ranking, but as a diagnostic tool. The person who humiliates you publicly is not expressing anger. Anger would have pulled you aside. What they're expressing is the need to claim your dignity as something they have the right to remove, and to do it where it can be witnessed and remembered. The forgiveness calculation fails in a specific way with this act. Forgiving the person does not restore what happened in that room. The audience still carries the memory. The moment is not neutralized by your magnanimity. Calling it forgiven only releases the actor from the weight of what they chose to do in front of other people. The record stays. The third act is when someone systematically made you doubt your own perception. Nietzsche believed the highest expression of the will to power was not physical domination. It was the ability to define reality for another person, to make them uncertain of what they know, to substitute your version of events for theirs until they can no longer tell the difference. The deliberate, sustained undermining of another person's account of their own experience. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately as a power move dressed in the language of reason. That's not what I said. You're too sensitive. You always do this. These are not clarifications. They are precision instruments for eroding the ground another person stands on. The reason this act sits in its own category is specific. Every other harm on this list damages what you have. A reputation, a relationship, a sense of security. This one goes after the instrument you use to navigate everything else. A person who deliberately corrupts your perception is not in conflict with you. They are at war with your capacity to think. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The fourth act is when someone used your vulnerability against you. At some point, you decided to let someone in. This was not carelessness. It was trust, chosen deliberately. You told them something that cost you something to say, about a fear you were working through, about a wound that had not finished closing. You handed them the soft part because you believed they would treat it as such. And then, when the relationship changed or the conflict arrived, they reached back for exactly that thing. The thing you told them when you were open, when you were trying to be close. They converted your honesty into an instrument. Nietzsche was not sentimental about intimacy. He understood that exposing yourself to another person is always a risk, and he did not pretend otherwise. What he would identify here is not that your vulnerability was the problem. The problem was not in what you revealed. It was in who was present to receive it. There's something specific about this act that makes standard forgiveness structurally wrong. If you forgive the person who weaponized your openness, the lesson your nervous system carries forward is not to open. Not with anyone. The act does not just wound you once. It trains you to be smaller every time afterward. That is not a personal injury. That is damage to your ability to connect with anyone ever again. The fifth act is when someone abandoned you at your lowest point. There is a particular kind of person who is present during the easy periods of your life and absent during the difficult ones. Not absent by circumstance, absent by choice, which is a different thing entirely. Nietzsche wrote extensively about friendship in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and was deeply suspicious of relationships that could not survive contact with hardship. His skepticism was not pessimism. It was precision. He understood that the actual content of any relationship only becomes visible under pressure. The person who withdraws when things get hard is not overwhelmed. They are revealing the terms they had always been operating on, terms that were never really about you. The specific damage this act causes is not only in the abandonment itself. It is in the false picture it leaves behind. You spend months, sometimes years, trying to figure out what you did wrong, trying to construct an explanation for an absence that had nothing to do with your behavior. Forgiving it does not correct that picture. It just covers it with a frame. The sixth act is when someone systematically worked to kill your ambitions. Nietzsche had a name for the force that pulls exceptional individuals back toward the average. He called it the spirit of gravity, der Geist der Schwer. It is the weight of other people's expectations, the social pressure to remain unremarkable, the consistent discouragement from those who cannot stand watching someone attempt more than they dared. The person who mocked what you were building was not offering perspective. They were exercising control. Each dismissal was a quiet bet on your failure. Each joke at the expense of your work was an investment in your staying where you were. Nietzsche identified this as one of the purest expressions of ressentiment, the inability to create converted into the compulsion to diminish. What makes this act particularly difficult to name is its patience. It does not strike once and leave a wound you can point to. It works over months and years, consistently, until the target begins to hear the mocker's voice in their own head. The voice that says the thing is too big, the plan is too much, the ambition is embarrassing. Forgiving the person who planted that voice does not remove it. It gives them permission to keep putting it there. The seventh act is when someone used your love or loyalty as the instrument itself. This is the one that is hardest to look at directly, because looking at it honestly requires admitting something uncomfortable about yourself, not just about them. There are people who did not hurt you through cruelty or indifference. They hurt you through something more precise. They understood that you loved them or were loyal to them or would not leave, and they used that knowledge deliberately. They knew the consequence of their behavior before they chose it. They knew you would stay. They knew you would excuse it. They knew, in the most specific way, that your attachment to them was their protection from accountability. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil about pity, which he named Mitleid, and about how relationships built on the willingness to endure can quietly become relationships built on the expectation that you will endure. The person who exploits your loyalty is not unaware of what they are doing. They are counting on your goodness the way a card player counts on a predictable opponent. The act that cannot be forgiven here is not their behavior in isolation. It is what the behavior reveals, that they looked at your love for them and saw a resource. That is not a mistake. That is a verdict. Nietzsche's answer to these 7 acts is not revenge. It is not bitterness either. It is something harder than both of those things. It is accuracy. The conventional response to a serious injury is forgiveness, and most people accept this without examining why. But Nietzsche would point out that forgiveness and resentment share a structural problem. Both of them keep the person who hurt you at the center of your attention. Resentment obsesses over what they did. Forgiveness obsesses over whether you have sufficiently released what they did. In either case, you are still organized around them. You are still spending your interior life on someone who may not be spending a moment of theirs on you. What he proposed instead was something closer to clarity, not the performance of moving on, not the claim that you have forgiven and therefore the matter is closed. An honest reckoning with what happened, who the person was, and what the relationship actually contained. He believed this kind of honest reckoning was a prerequisite for what he called self-overcoming. The process of becoming more than what you currently are requires an accurate accounting of where you actually stand. Amor fati is one of his most discussed concepts. People tend to translate it as love your fate and render it into something like cheerful acceptance. But that is not what Nietzsche meant. He meant something more demanding, that you stop organizing your life around an edited version of what happened, that you look at the injury without softening it, without rushing toward a resolution that the situation does not actually require, and without performing the virtue that other people need to see from you. The injury happened. The person did what they did. That is the ground you are standing on. He wanted you to feel it fully before you built anything on top of it. There's a version of forgiveness that is genuinely powerful. It is the forgiveness that comes not because someone asked for it or earned it, but because the person who was hurt has truly moved past it. That forgiveness does not need to be announced. It does not ask for a witness. The person who has genuinely moved past an injury is no longer carrying it, and they're not carrying a performance of having released it either. But that is not what most people mean when they tell you to forgive. Most of the time, what they mean is, stop making this visible. Stop making the rest of us uncomfortable by acknowledging that the thing happened. Nietzsche would say that is not a request for your healing. It is a request for your silence. The 7 acts described here are not a list of grievances to preserve. They are descriptions, accurate descriptions of what happens when trust is converted into a weapon, when dignity is removed in public, when someone's perception of reality is quietly dismantled, when vulnerability is offered back as cruelty, when abandonment arrives dressed as circumstance, when ambition is treated as a threat, and when loyalty is read as a license to keep going. Nietzsche did not believe that seeing these things clearly made a person bitter. He believed it made a person free. There is a significant difference between clarity and bitterness, even when they look similar from the outside. Bitterness is still reaching for the injury, still unable to look away. Clarity is the refusal to describe the injury as something other than what it was. Some people in your life did not make mistakes with you. They made choices. They made them repeatedly, or they made one that was large enough and deliberate enough to constitute a verdict on what you meant to them. That is hard to hold without either softening it through forgiveness or hardening it through resentment. Nietzsche's answer, across his entire body of work, was neither softness nor hardness. It was becoming. The self that survives what happened to it, sees it without flinching, and moves forward with its eyes open rather than covered. Some things are not forgiven. They are simply finished. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.